Hello, and thank you to the organizers for welcoming us to come talk with all of you and share a little bit about our project that we've been working on. Well, we're just about finished with it, and we want to share a bit with you about food security and food sovereignty. A lot of this work that we'll share with you has been funded through the National Science Foundation. So my name is Carolina Behe. I'm the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and I'm here in Alaska. All of the information we share with you today is coming from Indigenous knowledge. So we ask that if any concepts, points, or information is shared from the presentation, that you make sure to credit those Indigenous knowledge holders back to the presentation. So for those of you that may not be familiar, the Inuit Circumpolar Council was formed in 1977 when Eben Hobson Sr. from Utqiagvik, Alaska brought Inuit together. His vision was to unite all Inuit across imposed borders to address common concerns with a common voice. Today, ICC advocates on behalf of 180,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Here you see Inuit Nunaat. We engage in topics such as food security, sustainability, and biodiversity through science, Indigenous knowledge, and policy. ICC holds Consultative 2 status at the UN and is one of 6 permanent participants at the Arctic Council. Most of our work is done at an international level, but we do a lot of work at a national level also. And so we're directly engaged with Inuit communities here in Alaska. And a lot of this first that we'll share with you was put forward by them. So all of the ICC is directed by Inuit across the Circumpolar through a declaration that is developed every 4 years. Currently, we're working under the Utqiagvik Declaration, and here you see all the key themes that are presented in that declaration that we're focused on. Well, like I said, we want to talk to you a bit about food sovereignty today, but to talk about food sovereignty, we first have to talk about food security. Though the term food security is more, you see it more and more in research and politics in the news, but how this term is defined and addressed often does not reflect what we are talking about and the holistic understanding of the Arctic that Inuit hold. Over the last 45 years or 50 years, hundreds of definitions for food security have been developed. These definitions are often focused on nutrients, calories, and purchasing power. All of these are part of food security, but Inuit food security is talking about much more than this. Well, to go further into about food security, we have to understand the Arctic ecosystem. Well, we drew this image because there actually wasn't any images out there that were depicting, or, that we saw in large areas or large institutions. So this is the ecosystem. This is the Inuit Arctic ecosystem, and it has multiple diverse parts. Everything shown is needed and is equally important. Here you have feast. This is just as important as the polychaetes, just as important as the zooplankton, the lichen, and just as important as the youth sharing his first catch. As one elder explained, the Arctic ecosystem it's like a puzzle with multiple puzzle pieces. You have language here, you have sharing, education, and all of this makes up the entire picture. These pieces are continuously moving and adjusting to one another, but they're all connected. He said this is food security. Food security is when you have a healthy environment, when all of these pieces are connected. And sometimes scientists think of these pieces as like systems. You can think of like language as a system, and it's connected to the biodiversity, it's connected to the water or the hydro system, and so on throughout the entire ecosystem. Even economics are part of this. So you see here that food security goes far beyond nutrients and calories. It includes spirituality, feasts, and much more. But a challenge arises when somebody comes and decides they're going to look at just one piece of that puzzle. Say they're just going to look at the Nanook or the polar bear, and they decide to make policy recommendations without recognizing how that's connected to all of the other pieces, not understanding cumulative impacts, or how all of this is interconnected to each other. Within this environment, decisions have to be made with an understanding of relationships and how these puzzle pieces connect to each other. It's important to understand that the health of the hunter is dependent on the health of the whale, but the health of the whale is also dependent on the health of the hunter. Again, this is what a healthy ecosystem is. So through this work here in Alaska, Inuit developed their own definition of food security, recognizing that those other definitions weren't encompassing everything they were talking about. This definition is long because it is the foundation of Inuit culture and holds all aspects of life. So we'll read through it just very quickly here. Food security is the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem, to access food, to caretake, protect, and respect all of life, land, water, and air. It allows for all Inuit to obtain, processes, store, and consume sufficient amounts of healthy and nutritious preferred food, foods that are physically and spiritually craved and needed from the land, air, and water, which provide for their families and future generations through the practice of Inuit customs and spirituality, languages, knowledge, policies, management practices, and self-governance. It includes the responsibility and ability to pass on knowledge to younger generations, the taste of traditional foods rooted in place and season, knowledge of how to safely obtain and prepare traditional foods for medicinal use, clothing, housing, nutrients, and overall, how to be within one's environment. Food security includes the recognition that food is a lifeline and a connection between the past and today's self and cultural identity. Inuit food security is characterized by environmental health and is made up of 6 interconnecting dimensions. And we'll get to that part in just a moment here. Because as part of this work, this conceptual framework was also developed. This is the shape of the drum because the drum is very important within the Inuit culture. You see, this drum lays out all of the components needed to understand, to assess, to see the environment, to understand food security. What you have in the center here is food security. Surrounding that is what characterizes food security. That's a healthy environment. And surrounding that are what we call interconnecting dimensions. Those are the dimensions that you need to make up a healthy environment. That's accessibility, availability, stability, health and wellness, decision-making power and management, and Inuit culture. But we have to remember that most people are trying to explain very complex concepts into English, and it's not their first language. And so it's important to take a look at the report and see how these words are defined. For example, if you just go on Google Scholar and search for health and wellness, you'll probably get a lot of papers about human health and wellness. But here, Inuit aren't only talking about humans. They're talking about the health and wellness of everything, of the animals, the air, the water, the ice, and even the relationship between, the health and wellness of the relationship between those pieces. Surrounding those dimensions on the outer ring there are the tools we need to support them. We need knowledge sources. That means we need both Indigenous knowledge and science. We need policy that supports them, and we need true co-management. On the outside of the drum, you'll see those 4 phrases there. Those are the 4 main Inuit dialects spoken here in Alaska, and they mean the spirit of all. This is like the sinew holding the drum together. It's the same thing. You can't piece out the spirituality part of it. And then you see the drum handle, and that's the food sovereignty. And what we found is that without food sovereignty, we cannot get to food security. So we cannot look at one piece of the puzzle to understand the Arctic. You must consider all the pieces and how they connect with each other, and the importance of understanding cumulative impacts. So let's take a look at one of the dimensions to consider what may weaken the dimension and further explain this point. Consider accessibility. Now, when we are talking about accessibility, we're talking about more than purchasing power or physical access to food sources. Accessibility may be impeded by loss of knowledge and or language. It may be impeded by regulations which conflict with Indigenous knowledge. It can be impeded by a shift in food web dynamics driven by climate change, or a shift in migration patterns driven by sports hunting, shipping, so on. The point here is that all of this is connected, and you cannot look at one aspect to understand food security in the Arctic, and it is important to understand cumulative impacts. Some may recognize this as an ecosystem perspective. However, this concept goes beyond for example, this is a concept map that was developed in the project to help explain how these pieces are interconnected. And the story that we like to try to tell with this walrus also tries to help explain some of the differences in Indigenous knowledge and science and why it's so important to have both. You know, science is often very good at limiting what variables it's going to look at in order to answer one specific question, whereas Indigenous knowledge often is bringing in a lot of information to have a more holistic understanding and asking different questions. So if you consider here a walrus and consider what a hunter needs to think about when going out to interact with the walrus, you have to think about sea ice thickness, about sea ice movement, about movement in the water, movement in the air, salinity. You have to think about the color of the tusk of the walrus, the behavior of the walrus, even the stomach content of the walrus, because people like to eat the stomach content. And the hunter has to consider all of these things. Hunter also has to consider the safety of the people in the boat and around them. But he also has to consider the young boy that's being taken out every year, learning his relationship with that walrus, and the first catch the first time that the walrus gives himself to the young hunter, and he brings his catch and he gives it to an elder, and he's become at that point a provider as opposed to being provided for. All of these components have to be considered. With this understanding, an understanding for the need to maintain a healthy environment, understanding that Inuit culture is part of that environment, there are many conservation measures that are part of Inuit everyday life. So again, we think of the drum. And think of all of the components that are necessary in order to understand this environment. Through all of this work, the Food Security Conceptual Framework report was developed. We encourage you to read that report. You can access it on our website or contact me and I can get you a copy of it. The report shares all this information and recommendations. Within Alaska, the report stressed, and it was voiced very loudly, that even though all these pieces are interconnected, with the biggest risk to food security or biggest driver to food insecurity is occurring here is the lack of decision-making power and management. Within the report, decision-making power and management is really defined as Inuit having a right over their own fate, the right to make these decisions themselves. And this is the definition that was developed. It's a right to self-governance. It's the right to utilizing holistic knowledge, utilizing Indigenous knowledge. It's the right to use management practices that have been in practice for thousands of years. And again, it's having control over one's own fate and their own cultural value system. In that report, there was a lot of recommendations, and one of those recommendations was to look at what type of management practices and agreements were being used in other Inuit regions, such as Canada, Greenland, or Chukotka. And so working with our partners, this project was developed to look at the co-management system within Alaska and the Inuvialuit settlement region of Canada, which is the Inuit region closest to us. And we'll see a map for that in just a second. Yeah, here's the map. So here you see the Inuvialuit settlement region right over here, and then also Alaska. Through this project, we looked at the management and co-management structures within Alaska and the Inuvialuit settlement region to understand how Those frameworks support or need to be modified to achieve Inuit food sovereignty. Really, we looked at what supports or impedes Inuit food sovereignty. In this work, food sovereignty is defined as the right of Inuit to define their own hunting, gathering, fishing, land, and water policies, the right to define what is sustainable, socially, economically, and culturally appropriate, to maintain ecological health, and the right to determine ecological and cultural sustainable practices for the distribution of foods, the right to define their own food system and to maintain identified practices for obtaining, processing, storing, and consuming traditional foods. Now, this work was not just about doing a legal review. It was primarily actually about hearing directly from Inuit what is supporting or impeding Inuit food sovereignty. Because what's on the books isn't necessarily what's in practice, and it's not necessarily reflective of what should be there. So the work has resulted in a report that has over 90 contributing authors, a 9-member advisory committee, a project team, and multiple partners. We have worked with our partners to facilitate multiple focus groups, workshops, and conduct individual interviews. Our partners include the Eskimo Walrus Commission, Fisheries Joint Management Committee, Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission, the New Wild Game Council, Association of Village Council Presidents, and has been advised by our ICC office in Canada. This work is also done in collaboration with the Environmental Law Institute, and again is funded through the National Science Foundation. That's a lot to say that we took 3 years to put all this information together into a report that we encourage you to read. And that report is being used to inform direction at the United Nations, at the Arctic Council, to inform management and policy, and will continue to be used to try to make stronger positions and to gain stronger food sovereignty. You will see in the report that the authors stress that Inuit have their own rules, policies, and practices. This important report provides transformative recommendations, barriers, key findings, important Inuit perspectives on international instruments such as free, prior, and informed consent, Inuit values, management practices, and much more. The recommendations are listed under 8 common themes. Please take a close look at these in the report. The recommendations will sound familiar, but have been applied because not just Inuit, but Indigenous peoples have been really loudly talking about these for a very long time. And if they were applied, we would see the transformative change that many across the world are asking for to address management, food security, food sovereignty, and overall the health of the Arctic. While there's not time to go into too much detail about the recommendations or the report, we would like to share with you a few points. Through this work, again, Inuit have stressed strongly that management is not new. Though this is not a term that a lot of people use within their Inuit dialects, Inuit have had rules, policies, and practices from time immemorial. How to maintain balance within the environment, how to hold relationships with everything else within this environment is not new. What is new or newer is the Western management approaches. Many Inuit practices are still applied today, such as never take more than you need, use all parts of the animal, that you cannot waste any part of that animal. Inuit approaches also require adaptive decision-making. If the weather is raining and going to cause the drying fish to mold, you will need to change when you get the fish. A challenge arises when regulations conflict with the Indigenous knowledge and what Inuit are observing in that environment. There is often a challenge with management and regulations that are driven solely by dominating cultures and one source of knowledge. Regulations or decisions that separate people from the environment, and decisions made far from Indigenous homelands with no understanding of the adaptive, quick decisions that need to be made for the well-being of the entire ecosystem. It is important to understand how differing values, different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing the world guide management, decision-making, policy, and how this affects the entire environment. For example, Inuit management practices are not single species focused. There is a strong focus on cumulative impacts, understanding relationships between components and multiple variables, a holistic understanding, a food security lens approach. These practices need to be at the forefront of discussions, not just at a national level, but at an international level. Overall, much more work needs to occur to recognize and support Inuit food sovereignty. Remembering the food security conceptual framework, the drum, building the supporting Inuit food sovereignty supports the health of the entire ecosystem. Remember that the health of the walrus depends on the hunter, just as the health of the hunter depends on the health of the walrus. Again, we would encourage you to read the food security report and the food sovereignty and self-governance work. All of the work can be found on our webpage, but I'm also, if you contact me, I'm also happy to just send you a copy of that too. With that, Koyana, to everybody who's taken time to see this video, and to the organizers for welcoming us here. And I hope that we do hear from some of you in the future. Okay, Koyana.